Hey there, everybody. What's up? Welcome back to People's Historian, the show where we read about 30 minutes of history together. My name is Jason Kishineff, and we're reading an Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. I believe we're in Chapter 11. Remember, if you like the show, hit that like and subscribe button, hit that notification bell, and YouTube will notify you when I make a new video. Let's dig in, shall we? Land claims. This is Hermione. Now, no biting me. With a large part of indigenous nations' territories and resources in what is now the United States taken through aggressive war, outright theft, and legislative appropriations, Native peoples have vast claims to reparations and restitution. Indigenous nations negotiated numerous treaties with the United States that included land transfers and monetary compensation, but the remaining indigenous territories have steadily shrunk due to direct federal appropriation by various means, as well as through government failure to meet its obligation to protect indigenous land holdings as required under treaties. The U.S. government has acknowledged some of these claims and has offered monetary compensation. However, since the upsurge of Indian rights movements in the 1960s, indigenous nations have demanded restoration of treaty-guaranteed land rather than monetary compensation. Native Americans, including those who are legal scholars, ordinarily do not use the term reparations in reference to their land claims and treaty rights. Rather, they demand restoration, restitution, or repatriation of lands acquired by the United States outside valid treaties. These demands for return of lands and water and other resource rights illegally taken certainly could be termed reparations, but they have no parallel in the monetary reparations owed, for example, to Japanese Americans for forced incarceration, or to descendants of enslaved African Americans. No monetary amount can compensate for lands illegally seized, particularly those sacred lands necessary for indigenous peoples to regain social coherence. One form of native claim does seek monetary compensation and might provide a template for other classes. Of the hundreds of lawsuits for federal trust mismanagement that indigenous groups have filed, most since the 1960s, the largest and best known is the Cobell v. Salazar class action suit, initially filed in 1996 and settled in 2011. The individual indigenous litigants from many native nations claimed that the U.S. Department of the Interior, as trustee of indigenous assets, had lost, squandered, stolen, and otherwise wasted hundreds of millions of dollars dating back to the forced land allotment beginning in the late 1880s. By the end of 2009, it was clear that the case was headed for a decision favoring the indigenous groups when the lead plaintiffs, representing nearly 500,000 indigenous individuals, accepted a $3.4 billion settlement proposed by the Obama administration. The amount of the settlement was greater than the $500 million that the court would likely have awarded. However, what was sacrificed in the settlement was a detailed accounting of the federal government's malfeasance. As one reporter lamented, the result will see some involved with the case, especially lawyers, become quite rich, while many Indians, the majority in all likelihood, will receive about a third of what it takes to feed a family of 4 for just 1 year. Another important form of reparations is the repatriation of remains of dead ancestors and burial items. After considerable struggle on the part of indigenous religious practitioners, Congress enacted the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990, or NAGPRA, which requires that museums return human remains and burial items to the appropriate indigenous communities. It is fitting that Congress used the term repatriation in the act. Before NAGPRA, the federal government had used repatriation to describe the return of remains of prisoners of war to foreign nations. Native American nations are sovereign as well, and Congress correctly characterized the returns as repatriations. Although compensation for federal trust mismanagement and repatriation of ancestral remains represent important victories, land claims and treaty rights are most central to indigenous peoples' fight for reparations in the United States. The case of the Great Sioux Nation exemplifies the persistence among indigenous nations and communities to protect their sovereignty and cultures. The Sioux have never accepted the validity of the U.S. confiscation of Pahasapa, the Black Hills. Mount Rushmore is controversial among Native Americans because it is located in the Black Hills. Members of the American Indian movement led occupations of the monument beginning in 1971. Return of the Black Hills was the major Sioux demand in the 1973 occupation of Wounded Knee. Due to a decade of intense protests and occupations by the Sioux, on July 23, 1980, in United States v. Sioux Nation of Indians, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the Black Hills had been taken illegally and that remuneration equal to the initial offering price plus interest, nearly $106 million, be paid. But when you think about that, with inflation, $106 million is not nearly high enough. The Sioux refused the award and continued to demand return of the Black Hills. Good for them. The money remained in an interest-bearing account, which by 2010 amounted to more than $757 million. Not bad. The Sioux believed that accepting the money would validate the U.S. theft of their most sacred land. The Sioux Nation's determination to repatriate the Black Hills attracted renewed media attention in 2011. A segment of the PBS NewsHour titled, "For Great Sioux Nation, Black Hills Can't Be Bought for $1.3 billion," aired on August 24th. The reporter described a Sioux reservation as one of the most difficult places in which to live in the United States. Few people in the Western Hemisphere have shorter life expectancies. Males, on average, live to just 48 years old. Females to 52. Almost half of all people above the age of 40 have diabetes. And the economic realities are even worse. Unemployment rates are consistently above 80%. In Shannon County, inside the Pine Ridge Reservation, half the children live in poverty, and the average income is $8,000 a year. But there are funds available. A federal pot now worth more than $1 billion. That sits here in the U.S. Treasury Department waiting to be collected by 9 Sioux tribes. The money stems from a 1980 Supreme Court ruling that set aside $105 million to compensate the Sioux for the taking of the Black Hills in 1877, an isolated mountain range rich in minerals that stretched from South Dakota to Wyoming. The only problem, the Sioux never wanted the money because the land was never for sale. Gotta respect that integrity there. That's a lot of money to turn down, especially now. If it was $700 million in 2010, it's probably twice that now. That one of the most impoverished communities in the Americas would refuse $1 billion demonstrates the relevance and significance of the land to the Sioux. Not as an economic resource, but as a relationship between people and place. A profound feature of the resilience of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Economic self-determination. The relationship of economic development and indigenous peoples in the United States is not a 20th century phenomenon. The collusion of business and government in the theft and exploitation of indigenous lands and resources is the core element of colonization and forms the basis of U.S. wealth and power. By the end of the 19th century, indigenous communities had little control over their resources or their economic situations, receiving only royalties for mining and leasing, funds held in trust in Washington. During the Johnson administration's war on poverty, most reservation economic development was spurred by funding and grants from the Economic Development Administration, the Office of Economic Opportunity, and other government agencies. Excuse me. The Bureau of Indian Affairs began a program to woo industrial plants to reservations, promising cheap labor and infrastructure investment. The largest such experiment was that of the giant electronics company Fairchild's assembly plant in the Navajo Nation. Established at the town of Shiprock, gotta love that name, although it might not be the best name for a home. I do enjoy that name. Established at the town of Shiprock, not Shipwreck. Established at the town of Shiprock in the northeastern part of the reservation in New Mexico, 1969. The plant became the single largest industrial employer in New Mexico by 1975. 1,200 Navajos made up the initial workforce. By 1974, the numbers had lessened to 1,000, but still Navajos were 95% of the workforce. Thus, during 1974 and 1975, the Navajo workforce shrunk to 600. Fairchild's Mountain View, California headquarters claimed that Navajos were quitting, something very common in the electronics assembly industry. Non-Indians were being hired to replace Navajos. What actually had been happening were layoffs, not resignations. The federal government subsidized the wages for the 6-month training period on the job, for which Little training is required, and Fairchild was laying off those workers whom they would have to pay and hiring new trainees at no cost. Local Navajo activists and former Fairchild's employees, along with help from American Indian movement leaders, organized a protest at the plant, which led to the workers occupying it. Fairchild decommissioned the plant and moved it overseas. Oh, doesn't that just figure? Sorry. Documents recovered by protesters revealed that Fairchild was seeking a pretext to break its lease. The Navajo Nation had built the plant to Fairchild's specifications at a cost of $3.5 million. The Indian Self-Determination Act of 1975 validated indigenous control over their own social and economic development with continuation of federal financial obligations under treaties and agreements. Acting upon the new mandate, a number of indigenous nations with mineral resources formed the Council of Energy Resource Tribes, or CERT, which means something totally different if you live here. It's like a community emergency response team. But here, for these purposes, it's Council of Energy Resource Tribes. Patterned after the Federation of Oil Producing States, OPEC, Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, CERT sought to renegotiate mineral leases that the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, had practically given away to energy companies. Native lands west of the Mississippi held considerable resources. 30% of the low sulfur 30% of the low sulfur coal in the United States, 5% of the oil, 10% of the natural gas, and 80% of the uranium. CERT was able to establish a center of information and action in Denver to serve its members with technical and legal assistance. The Jicarilla Apache Nation slapped a severance tax on the oil and gas taken from their lands. A corporate legal challenge to this wound up in the Supreme Court, which found that Native nations had the right to tax corporations that operated in their boundaries. Navajo Chairman Peter MacDonald was the force behind the founding of CERT and was its first director, but he quickly found his scheme of mining at the basis for economic development challenged by young Navajos who perceived the downside of ecological destruction. You think? Strip mining of coal and uranium in the Navajo Nation was bad enough, but then a coal gasification plant was established to feed into the Navajo electricity generating plant that sent power to Phoenix and Los Angeles, but provided Navajos with little or none. Now, what sense does that make? Navajo activist John Redhouse, who became director of the National Indian Youth Council, led decades of struggle against unrestricted mining, with new generations continuing the fight. Like many deindustrializing U.S. cities and states in the 1980s, some Native nations turned to gaming for revenue. In 1986, they formed the National Indian Gaming Association for the purpose of lobbying state and federal governments and to represent the interests of its members. But in 1988, Congress passed the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, which gave the states some control over gaming, a dangerous surrender of sovereignty for those Native nations operating casinos. Indigenous gaming operations now constitute a $26 billion industry annually that employs 300,000 people, with about half the 564 federally recognized nations operating casinos of various sizes. Profits have been used in myriad ways, some for per capita payments, others earmarked for educational and linguistic development, housing, hospitals, and even investing in larger projects such as the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of the American Indian. A good portion of profits go to lobbying politicians of state and federal governments. The Indian gaming lobby in California, for instance, is second only to the prison guards union in the state. The narrative of dysfunction. The mainstream media and books regularly expose and denounce the poverty and social dysfunction found in indigenous communities. Rates of alcoholism and suicide are far higher than national averages, and higher even than in other communities living in poverty. In a book of case studies of poverty and neglected sites of deterioration in the United States, journalist Chris Hedges offered an impassioned account of the Pine Ridge Reservation. As well-meaning and accurate as such portrayals are, however, they miss the specific circumstances that reproduce indigenous poverty and social scarring, namely the colonial condition. As Vine Deloria Jr. and other Native American activists and scholars have emphasized, there is a direct link between the suppression of indigenous sovereignty and the powerlessness manifest in depressed social conditions. Deloria Jr. explained that for the Sioux, everyone has responsibility and rituals to perform that involve a particular geography. In their case, this means sites in the Black Hills. Some of the holy men go up there will say that a lot of the social problems with the Sioux are a result of losing the Black Hills, so you couldn't perform your duties and become a contributor to the ongoing creation. And consequently, people began to fall away, and they started to suffer, and they started to fight among themselves. In continuing to disregard treaty rights, and you can't sit on my chest while I'm reading. Sorry, I lost my place here. In continuing to disregard treaty rights and deny restitution of sacred lands such as the Black Hills, the federal government prevents indigenous communities from performing their most elemental responsibilities as inscribed in their cultural and religious teachings. In other words, sovereignty equates to survival. Sovereignty equates to survival. Nationhood instead of genocide. Ethnographer Nancy Oestreich, which I'm pretty sure means Austria, Nancy Oestreich, provocatively described Indian drinking as the world's oldest ongoing protest demonstration. The effects of continued colonization form similar patterns among indigenous communities throughout the Americas, as well as among the Maori of New Zealand and the Australian Aborigines. The experience of generations of Native Americans is on and off reservation boarding schools run by the federal government or Christian missions contributed significantly to the family and social dysfunction still found in Native communities. Generations of child abuse, including sexual abuse, from the founding of the first schools by missionaries in the 1830s and the federal government in 1875 until most were closed and the remaining ones reformed in the 1970s, traumatized survivors and their progeny. In 2002, a coalition of indigenous groups started the Boarding School Healing Project, which documented through research and oral history the extensive abuses that go beyond individual casualties to disruption of indigenous life at every level. Sun Elk was the first child from the traditional Taos Pueblo to attend the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, spending 7 years there beginning in 1883. After a harsh re-entry into Taos society, he told his story. They told us that Indian ways were bad. They said we must get civilized. I remember that word too. It means be like the white man. I am willing to be like the white man, but I did not believe Indians' ways were wrong. But they kept teaching us for 7 years, and the books told how bad the Indians had been to the white men, burning their towns and killing their women and children. But I had seen white men do that to Indians. We all wore white men's clothes and ate white men's food, and went to white men's churches and spoke white men's talk. And so after a while, we also began to say Indians were bad. We laughed at our own people in their blankets and cooking pots and sacred societies and dances. Corporal punishment was unknown in indigenous families, but was routine in the boarding schools. Often punishment was inflicted for being too Indian. The darker the child, the more often and severe the beatings. The children were made to feel that it was criminal to be Indian. A woman whose mother experienced boarding school related the results. Probably my mother and her brothers and sisters were the first in our family to go to boarding school, and the stories she told were horrendous. There were beatings. There was a very young classmate, I don't know how old they were, probably preschool or grade school, who lost a hand in having to clean this machine that baked bread or cut dough or something, and having to kneel for hours on cold basement floors as punishment. My mother lived with a rage all her life, and I think the fact that they were taken away so young was part of this rage, and how the fallout was on us as a family. Ponca historian Roger Buffalohead verifies that testimony. The idea of corporal punishment, so foreign to traditional Indian cultures, became a way of life for those students returning from their educational experience. Yet you find by the 30s and 40s in most Native communities where large numbers of young people had in the previous years attended boarding schools, an increasing number of parents who utilized corporal punishment in the raising of their children, so that although you can't prove a direct connection, I think you can certainly see that boarding school experiences where corporal punishment was the name of the game had their impact on the next generation of Native people. Sexual abuse of both girls and boys was also rampant. One woman remembers, "We had many different teachers during those years. Some got the girls pregnant and had to leave. One teacher would put his arms around and fondle this girl, sometimes taking her on his lap. When I got there, Mr. M put his arm around me and rubbed my arm all the way down. He rubbed his face against mine. At one mission school, a priest was known for his sexual advances. Anyway, I ended up beside him, the priest, and all of a sudden he started to feel my legs. I was getting really uncomfortable, and he started trying to put his hands in my pants. Nuns also participated in sexual abuse. A nun was sponge bathing me and proceeded to go a little too far with her sponge bathing, so I pushed her hand away. She held my legs apart while she strapped the insides of my thighs. I never stopped her again. Much documentation and testimony attest to the never-ending resistance by children in boarding schools. Running away was the most common way to resist, but there... Do you mind? Get off. Running away was the most common way to resist, but there were also acts of non-participation and sabotage, secretly speaking their languages and practicing ceremonies. This surely accounts for their survival, but the damage is nearly incomprehensible. Mohawk historian, I am not going to pronounce this correctly, I'm sorry, Tayayaki Alfred. Mohawk historian Tayayaki Alfred asks, what is the legacy of colonialism? Dispossession, disempowerment, and disease inflicted by the white man, to be sure. Yes, the enemy is in plain view. Residential schools, racism, expropriation, extinguishment, worship, welfare. Indigenous women in particular have continued to bear the brunt of sexual violence, both within families and by settler predators, including incidents of rape on reservations has long been astronomical. The colonialist restrictions on indigenous policing authority on reservations, yet another legacy of the doctrine of discovery and the impairment of indigenous sovereignty, opened the door to perpetrators of sexual violence who knew there would be no consequences for their actions. Under the U.S. colonial system, jurisdiction for crimes committed on native lands falls to federal and state authorities, because native justice can be applied only to reservation residents, and then only for misdemeanors. 1 in 3 Native American women has been raped or experienced attempted rape, and the rate of sexual assault on Native American women is more than twice the national average. For 5 years after publication of a scathing 2007 report by Amnesty International, Native American and women's organizations, including the National Organization for Women, or NOW, lobbied Congress to add a new section to the 1994 Violence Against Women Act, addressing the special situation of Native American women living on reservations. The added provision would allow Native nations... Seriously? No thank you. No thank you. The added provision would allow Native nations courts jurisdiction to arrest and prosecute non-Native men who entered reservations and commit rape. At the end of 2012, the Republican-dominated U.S. Congress denied reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act because it included the provision. In March 2013, however, that opposition was overcome, and President Barack Obama signed the amended act back into law. A small step forward for native sovereignty. Getting on a half an hour with a couple pages left. You mind if I just push on and finish it? No? Good, let's do it. Indigenous governance. For generations, Native nations, occasionally with the help of federal or state government, treated the symptoms of colonialism. But with the powerful indigenous self-determination movements of the second half of the 20th century, those nations participated in drafting and instituting new international law that supports their aspirations, and they began working on shoring up their sovereignty through governance. Through this work, U.S. indigenous peoples have reconceptualized their current forms of government based on new constitutions that reflect their specific cultures. Navajo, thinking on a future constitution, expresses that desire. Navajo thinking on a future constitution expresses that desire. Like some other native nations, the Navajo, the most populous and the one holding the largest land base in the United States, has never had a constitution. But others do have constitutions similar to that of the United States. Following the Indian Reorganization Act of that year, another 130 nations wrote constitutions according to federal guidelines, but without significant participation of their citizenry. The movement to create, revise, or rewrite constitutions has seen notable success in two instances during the first decade of the 21st century. From 2004 to 2006, the Osage Nation, located in northeastern Oklahoma, engaged in a contentious process of reform that produced a new constitution. The preamble reflects the extraordinary context and content of the new law. We, the Wazaze, or is it Wajaje, known as the Osage people, having formed as clans in the far distant past, have been a people, and as a people have walked this earth and enjoyed the blessing of Wakonta for more centuries than we truly know. Having resolved to live in harmony, we now come together so that we may once more unite as a nation and as a people, calling upon the fundamental values that we hold sacred: justice, fairness, compassion, respect for and protection of child, elder, all fellow beings, and self. Paying homage to generations of Osage leaders of the past and present, we give thanks for their wisdom and courage, acknowledging our ancient tribal order as the foundation of our present government, first reformed in the 1881 Constitution of the Osage Nation. We continue our legacy by again reorganizing our government. This Constitution, created by the Osage people, hereby grants to every Osage citizen a vote that is equal to all others and form a government that is accountable to the citizens of the Osage Nation. We, the Osage people, based on centuries of being a people, now strengthen our government in order to preserve and perpetuate a full and abundant Osage way of life that benefits all Osages, living and yet unborn. Similarly, in 2009, the White Earth Nation of the Anishinaabe Ojibwe people adopted a new constitution. White Earth is located in central Minnesota and is one of a number of Anishinaabe reservations in Minnesota, with others in Wisconsin, South Dakota, and Canada. The preamble to the White Earth Constitution is revealing. The Anishinaabe of the White Earth Nation are the ancestors of the great tradition of continental liberty, a native constitution of families, totemic associations. The Anishinaabe creates stories of natural reason, of courage, loyalty, humor, spiritual inspiration, survivance, reciprocal altruism, and native cultural sovereignty. We, the Anishinaabe of the White Earth Nation, in order to secure an inherent and essential sovereignty to promote traditions of liberty, justice, and peace, and reserve common resources, and to ensure the inalienable rights of native governance for our posterity, do constitute, ordain, and establish this Constitution of the White Earth Nation. Gerald Visner, a citizen of the White Earth Nation, best-selling author and leading intellectual, participated in the writing of this Constitution, explaining the concept of survivance, a term he coined. He stresses that it originates in indigenous narratives. The conventions of survivance create a sense of native presence over nihility, I'm going with that pronunciation, and victory. Survivance is an active presence. It is not absence, deracination, or ethnographic oblivion. And survivance is the continuation of narratives, not a mere reaction, however pertinent. Survivance stories are renunciations of dominance, the unbearable sentiments of tragedy, and the legacy of victimry. The doctrine of discovery is dissolving in light of these profound acts of sovereignty, but neither arcane colonial laws nor the historical trauma of genocide simply disappear with time. Certainly not when conditions of life and consciousness perpetuate them. Excuse me. I almost made it without that. The indigenous self-determination and sovereignty movement is not only transforming the continent's indigenous communities and nations, but also inevitably the United States. The ways it is doing that are explored in the concluding chapter. And you will have to tune into the next episode to hear it. I hope you do. Thanks for joining me. Hit that like and subscribe button if you enjoyed it. See you next time.